So, Rabbi Jason.
Thank you. So just before the text comes up, there it is, I need to give a bit of context here. So we know that the book of Genesis talks about the origins of the Jewish people. Abraham is the first monotheist. That means he makes it his mission to teach the world that there is one God and we are under God's control. And God enters into a pact, an agreement, what we call a covenant with Abraham, that if Abraham will teach his children certain ways, which they will share with the world, Abraham will be blessed to be the leader of a nation, the Jewish nation, that will have an effect on the world. And he will be blessed to be given a land, the land of Israel. But he has to pass on the teachings of God to his family. Abraham passes on this very important responsibility to his son Isaac. The next link in the chain of the development of this family that will become the Jewish nation, that will establish the kingdom of Israel, where eventually there will be a temple in Jerusalem, the holiest place in the world according to Jewish tradition, where priests will serve God in the temple, and from that place will come teachings that the world needs to hear. But Isaac, the next link in the chain, has two sons. One is called Esau, the elder son. One is called Jacob, the younger son, although they are twins. But one comes out first. And the rule in those days was that the eldest is entitled to the major inheritance of the family. That means in terms of position of authority. That means in terms of position of wealth, position of power, position of influence. And therefore, this will mean that if Esau, the elder, is to carry on the mantle, carry on the leadership position, that will mean that he has the power, he has the influence, he has the wealth, he has to be the one to be the teacher. Surely he has to have the right qualities. Well, Esau wasn't like that at all. Esau wasn't interested in spiritual things. He was a hunter. He was a killer. He was a person who wasn't interested in study. He wanted to be in the outdoors, killing animals and going on the rampage. That's the kind of person he was. But his dad, Isaac, believed he could bring that element out of him, even though his brother Jacob was actually the studious one, the spiritual one, the one willing to take on those responsibilities to serve God and to be a leader of values and morals. There's a lot to this story which I can't go into now, but the key thing to know as an introduction to this text is before Isaac dies, it's time for him to give the major blessings to pass on to the next generation of wealth, power, authority. And of course, he's planning to give all of these blessings to Esau. Before he's going to give these blessings to Esau, he says to Esau, you know that you go out and hunt the meat that I love, because Esau was a great hunter. It wasn't just so the dad was feeling hearty and enjoying a meal. He was giving his son the chance to do what we call in Judaism a mitzvah, fulfilling a precept, honoring his father. In the merit of honoring his father and bringing him dinner, these great blessings would be bestowed. Esau was always dressed in animal skins and had a certain scent to him and was very rough in terms of his skin. Off Esau goes to hunt for his father, but the mother, Isaac's wife, who can hear what's going on, is very concerned. If my husband gives the blessings of power and influence to Esau, he's going to misuse them. He's the wrong sort of person to lead the family and to become a future leader of the Jewish nation. So what does she do? She says to Jacob, the other son, while Esau's away, dress up as your brother. Pretend you're him so that you get these blessings. How will they get away with this? Simple. Isaac, the father, is blind. He's lost his sight by this stage. So that she's hoping that if Jacob externally feels and smells like Esau, he will be able to take the blessings. So to cut a long story short, Jacob comes in disguised as Esau and takes these blessings that were supposed to be Esau's blessing. Once Esau discovers this has happened, he wants to kill his brother. And so Jacob needs to escape from the family home, to leave the country, to go to his relatives in a faraway land where he will stay for 20 odd years. And this is where our text is going to pick up, where Jacob is now coming back to his family in the land of Canaan, which will later become the land of Israel. He's on his way back, and he's going to encounter the land that belongs to his brother Esau. So he sends ahead a message of peace. He sends a message to his brother, I'm coming. If you're going to fight me, I'm ready for you, but I want to greet you in a peaceable way. But Jacob does not know, having all these years before taken his brother's blessing, how will he be received? Will Esau forgive him? Will he still hate him? So what does he do? We'll pick up verse 3 of chapter 33, verses 1 to 17 on your screen. So he himself, this is Jacob. Now, Jacob has, in the years that he's been away, amassed his own wealth. So he's got cattle and he's got wives, children, maidservants. But he goes ahead of them all to present himself to his brother. And the text says, verse 3, he himself went on ahead and bowed low to the ground 7 times until he was near his brother. Esau ran to greet him. He embraced him, and falling on his neck, he kissed him, and they wept. So all appears to be good. The concern there may be fighting, the concern there might be hatred. There's an embrace and they kiss. Looking about, this is now talking about Esau. Esau sees the women and the children, the family that Jacob now has, and he says, who, he asked, are these with you? He answered, meaning Jacob answered, the children with whom God has favored your servant. Then the maids with their children came forward and bowed low. Next, Leah with her children came forward and bowed low. Just so you know, Jacob has 2 wives. That's a whole story in itself, why he ended up with 2 wives. He's got 2 wives. So both of the wives are being presented. All the children are being presented. And last, Joseph and Rachel came forward and bowed low. And then Esau asked, what do you mean by all this company which I have met? Jacob answered, to gain my Lord's favor. Now, before we go any further, something very strange here. What was the whole dispute? That Jacob has taken wealth and taken entitlement that should have been Esau's from Esau's point of view. Indeed, not just from Esau's point of view. He was the eldest, and it would have been understood that had things not happened differently, he would have been blessed with all this wealth. How on earth is this going to curry favor with Esau that Jacob appears to be showing off? Look how well I've done. Yeah, surely if you want to kind of appease Esau, you tone it down a bit. After all, the whole nature of the dispute was over who's got the most, who's got the power, who's got the wealth. So when he says, what's all this to gain favor, surely you could argue it looks a bit insensitive. Until we understand that what he's saying to his brother is, anything that I have here, I'm presenting to you. What I have amassed, my cattle, my wealth, I'm presenting it to you. Which is why, verse 9, Esau said, and there's actually a mistranslation here in the English, it's translating here, I have enough, my brother. The actual Hebrew means I have a lot. We'll see there's a big difference between those 2 concepts. So Esau says, I have a lot. So this seems to be saying, Jacob is saying, I know that my brother is materialistic. How will I appease him? By offering even more wealth. And Esau's response is, I've got a lot, I'm fine. Yeah? Let what you have remain yours. You stick with what you've got. I've got what I've got. Verse 10, but Jacob said, no, I pray you, if you would do me this favor, accept from me this gift, for to see your face is like seeing the face of God, and you have received me favorably. So what Jacob's saying, just the fact that I can see your face and the fact that we can be on good terms with one another, I don't care about any of the material things, I just want you to be happy. Again, a difference in the Hebrew from the English now, verse 11. This is what Jacob says, translated here. Please accept my present, which has been brought to you. That's not what the Hebrew says. The Hebrew uses the word birchati, which means my blessing. Please accept my blessing, which has been brought to you but God has favored me and I have plenty. What's going on here? Very powerful. There was an episode just before this, that before Jacob prepared to make the journey back to the land of Israel, he struggled all night with a mysterious person who the rabbis say is his own conscience. He feels bad that he took from his brother that he wasn't meant to have. And actually, all of the blessings that were given to Jacob were material blessings. And Jacob was interested in spiritual blessings, not material blessings. What he's saying to his brother is not just, I'm giving you these things to make you feel better. He's saying, I'm actually giving back to you what really is yours. Take the blessing which should have been yours back again. This is key to reconciliation, isn't it? It's not only that he's being nice to him, he's saying, I was wrong. This should have been yours. This wealth that I've amassed really belongs to you because Father thought he was talking to you when he blessed it with me. So that's an important difference in the English translation. Accept the blessing which really should have been yours, because this means more to you than it does to me. But we see also, when do you need reconciliation? You don't need reconciliation when two people are getting on with one another and they already have the same worldview. The difference before, when Esau says, I have a lot, and if you just look at verse 11, this is Jacob then saying, at the end of verse 11, it's translated, I have plenty. The Hebrew doesn't say that. The Hebrew is, I have everything. Jacob's view is, whatever God blesses me with, I'm happy with. I have everything because that's what God has blessed me with. Esau's worldview is, I'm only happy if I've got a lot of things. Jacob knows that his brother thinks differently, but yet we won't fall out over it. You're a materialist. I'm a spiritualist. We look at the world differently, but I know this is important to you to have these physical things. And even though Esau's saying, no, let you, what you have remain yours, he's doing that just to look magnanimous. In the end, he still takes what he wants. And that's why in the end, if you just pick it up from verse 15, verse 14, let my Lord go on ahead of his servant while I travel slowly at the pace of the cattle before me and at the pace of the children till I come to my Lord in Seir. And Esau said, let me assign to you some of the men who are with me. He said, oh no, my Lord is too kind to me. There's a kind of feigning, pretending to be very gracious, but actually wanting to take whatever he can, Esau. And it concludes that Esau started back that day to where he came from, Seir. But Jacob journeyed on to Sukkot and built a house for himself and made stalls for his cattle. In other words, they part company. It is only a momentary coming back together. They are going back to their separate lives, their separate ways of looking at the world, but at least they parted on good terms and don't allow these, shall we say, incompatibilities of how they look at the world to be a source of bitterness. So this is what we learn from this text. Even if people have different, it must never be a source of enmity and hatred. A lot to unpack.
Thank you. Thank you, Jason. Yeah, it's a fascinating text and a difficult one to unpack, and obviously one that's shared in different ways between all three faiths from different perspectives. So thank you very much. We're going to now go straight on to ask George Spencer to look at the text that's put down from the Christian New Testament from St. Luke's Gospel. George.
Shall I read it first?
Yeah. Yes, that's fine. Yes. Yeah.
So these are the words of Jesus, but I say to you that listen, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who begs from you. And if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask for them again. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, What credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. If you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again. But love your enemies, do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High. For he is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. So there should be speech marks at the end there, because that's all the words of Jesus as recorded in the Gospel of St. Luke. Well, what's a gospel? Gospel, they're held in particular reverence within the Christian tradition because they contain a record of the words of Jesus and the actions of Jesus, and they tell us also about Jesus's life, and in particular the end of his life, his arrest, his suffering, his death, and his resurrection. So in the Christian Bible, in the New Testament, we hold the Gospels in particular esteem. St. Luke wrote one of the four Gospels, and we have St. Luke here. He probably never knew Jesus, and we don't think that he was a Jew. Jesus was a Jew, of course, and lived in a Jewish milieu. But Luke, we suspect, was not a Jew, possibly a doctor, a physician. And we think this because he writes in excellent Greek and he writes in some detail. So you can imagine a doctor being quite careful about what they see and recording it well, what they hear and recording it well. What about this text then? Well, it's interesting to read what St. Luke is saying just before we have these words. And we're told that Jesus spent the night in prayer on a mountain. After that, he came down from the mountain and he gathered together disciples, followers, and he calls them by their name. And so he then instructs his disciples, and he begins by a series of blessings and then leads on to this text that we have here. So it'd be very interesting for me to discuss this with Rabbi Jason, because I think there's clear resonances with what we call the Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures, of Moses receiving the Ten Commandments from God as instruction as to how the people of Israel are to live. And what we seem to have here in Luke is a kind of new Ten Commandments, a reworking of teaching for the Christian community. St. Luke is wanting to record for us and tell us about how Christians are to live. And some of these things that are there, I suspect, about being struck on the cheek, for example, some of these things have resonances with particular instructions in the Jewish scriptures as well. What comes to us is mildly terrifying, I have to say, because the instructions that we have are extremely daunting, aren't they? I mean, we are told that if someone lends you money, well, don't worry about getting it back. If somebody strikes you on one cheek, offer them the other cheek. If someone takes your shirt, well, let them have your coat as well. You know, it's extreme and it's very challenging for us. I don't know many people who really follow through with this by seeking to follow these instructions very clearly. I used to visit a little community when I was a curate, which is like a beginning off as a clergy person in Edinburgh. There was a little community that every year, there was people living together, every year used to give away all that it had earned or been given or benefits that it had received, is to give them all away and start again with nothing. And that is the ultimate challenge that are in these words here. A lot of us as Christians will say, well, it's the attitude of our hearts that is important. And we would perhaps hit on that phrase there, do to others as you would have them do to you. So a lot of us turn it into being kind, being thoughtful, being compassionate, seeking to serve others. But I think really the words of Jesus here are challenging us to do more. And if you rank it up into how we live as communities, there aren't many countries in the world, are there, which would not have governments that seek to defend their borders, maintain the stability and prosperity of their people. And indeed, the refugee crisis at the moment challenges us, I suppose, in terms of how we use our resources. We tend to keep things for ourselves.
Many thanks, George. Yeah, the very striking picture there of if someone takes away your coat, give them even your shirt, of generosity and of hospitality. So Maysoon, if we can come to the passage from the Quran, and for you to give us some insights on this passage about the family of Imran that we've got on the screen now.
Okay, thank you, Alistair. So I will be reading the passage from the Quran, which is the chapter entitled The Family of Imran. Now, just to give you a bit of background as to who Imran actually is, he is the father of Mary. So Mary, obviously, as we all know, was the mother of Jesus. So he is Jesus's grandfather. That's the way we see it in Islam. So we have a whole chapter entitled in the Quran on him and the family of Maryam, who is Mary, who we refer to as Maryam in Arabic. So let's start off. I will be reading chapter 3, verse 102, all the way up to 104. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. You who believe, be mindful of God, as is his due, and make sure you devote yourselves to him to your dying moment. Hold fast to God's rope altogether. Do not split into factions. Remember God's favor to you. You were enemies, and then he brought your hearts together, and you became brothers by his grace. You were about to fall into a pit of fire, and he saved you from it. In this way, God makes his revelations clear to you so that you may be rightly guided. Be a community that calls for what is good, urges what is right, and forbids what is wrong. Those who do this are the successful ones. So let's take it bit by bit. Let's split it down. Let's look at the verse 102, where it is referring to Muslims asking us to devote ourselves every step of the way in our lives, all the way up to our dying moment. The firm belief is that you can live a life of piety. You can be so pious where you're a good Muslim, you're a believer, and you're doing everything right that you should be doing right. But at the last moment, when your soul is going to be taken from your body, when you're at your dying moment, as this verse is referring to, you go into disbelief. If that does happen, then you could have lived a life of piety, but you will die not as a Muslim. And this is what this verse is referring to, that you need to make sure as Muslims that you hold on to the rope of Allah. Now, there isn't actually a physical rope here. This rope is using in a context of the belief, reading the Quran, understanding the Quran, trying to understand what is being asked of you, your commands, and holding on to that rope. The latter part of that verse, 103, is asking you to not split into factions. So sometimes we have communities that go into an argumentative streak. Here we're talking about reconciliation. We're talking about standing together, parties coming together, making amends. So we do not split into factions. We do not go into groups and go into one arguing against the other. You stand firm as community. This is obviously referring to, just to give a bit of a historical background, to those people, the hostile Arab tribes that there were in the previous medieval times. The Ansar tribe were the tribe that helped Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, come to Medina when he emigrated. So it's a bit of an overlap with the migration here as well, and the refugee stance. But there was the Ansar tribe were the tribe who helped Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, to move. And this is when this whole reference is made here, that they were enemies, the hostile tribes were enemies, but then God made them hearts come together and bind them, and he saved them from the pit of fire. So he is clearly identifying what the punishment could have been, but they saved themselves from that. The last verse here, 104, is referring to be a community. So God is asking us all to be a community that calls for what is good, urges what is right, and forbids what is wrong. Those who do this are the successful ones. And I think the key kind of sentence here is those who do this are the successful ones. I know we've obviously had George obviously come in and give us reading of what you should be doing, the rights, and that is honestly the firm. I think there's a lap over here of the belief in Muslims as well, because that is what we have to do as Muslims also. So we have to believe and be a community that calls for good, but sometimes people may argue that this is a partitive duty because it's a fard kifaya. Fard kifaya in Arabic is just a term which means where some members of the community have to do it, not everyone. So that could be one argument on one side. But the other argument on the second fold could be that it's a common duty, it's a public duty. We all have to make sure that we call for good, we urge what is right, and we obviously forbid what is evil. But this is what this whole very, very, very short ayah, I've tried to summarize it in a very quick 5 minutes for you, Alistair, just not to overrun on our time.
Thank you ever so much, Maysoon. It's a real challenge to summarize what is a historic and widely used and interpreted text of any kind, isn't it? And I'm so grateful to you all for doing that for us. So we've got a bit of time now to just allow students or each other to unpack some of these texts and see what's in them, and also relate them to the subjects we'll be looking at GCSE or in our religious education, particularly how the texts apply to the themes today. So I'm going to ask Jake in a moment to feed some of those questions in. But first of all, to remind students, teachers, that you can put questions into chat if you have any, and type them in, and then we can explore those to match the things that you would want to explore and think about in your studies. But in the meantime, Jake, over to you.
So that was fantastic. Thank you for that. Linking this back to what students are probably looking at in school, and again, in the last session, for those who are with us, and it may be that we've got new classes, we were looking at the applied ethics section, which is what you'd find in many of the paper twos. I guess the big question when we're talking about reconciliation is the ends that we go to. And, you know, in a lot of these texts that we've looked at, it seems to be that reconciliation is critical. I guess the question that I would like to pose is, how does this fit in with something such as capital punishment, such as the death penalty, which is what our students will be looking at in the crime and punishment module. So if I could, I think it would be good maybe to start off with Rabbi Jason for this one. How would the death penalty factor into that story when reconciliation seems to be so critical?
Okay, so funny enough, our previous session, I appreciate some of the groups went on, it was about human life, sanctity of human life, and about ultimately taking of life is in God's hands. It is true that in ancient Israel, there was a supreme court called the Sanhedrin. which did have the power to affect capital punishment. But there's a tradition that says if they actually executed somebody more than once in 70 years, they were considered a cruel court. In other words, they were always trying to find ways within the law not to apply that particular punishment. The idea being the threat of it should be the deterrent. That if people feel that they are going to lose their life, then they would refrain from doing some acts that are so terrible. So too, when it comes to reconciliation, we know that Esau originally sought to kill Jacob. But ultimately, there were ways to appease him, whether at the point at which he comes to Jacob, he's kind of, it's the materialism that will satisfy him, or let's be charitable, that he's kind of got it out of his system and he's trying very hard to overcome those feelings of hatred, to say, look, I'll escort you, I'll be with you, etc. It's really about trying to find ways through, as we say, jaw, not war, right? Trying to find ways with reconciliation, even if, God forbid, somebody's been killed as a result of somebody's maliciousness. Will killing somebody else bring them back? Will that give people a sense of, justice? We have to be very careful that we don't confuse vengeance with justice. Yeah, and therefore, what we're trying to see in all of these ideas is there a way to make sure there isn't a constant cycle of bloodshed and vengeance, and when something terrible has happened? Reconciliation has to be the way, through talking, through compromise, through finding ways which aren't so drastic in order to move forward, not only in terms of the person who may have been wronged, whose life was taken, but also that people don't harbour hate, because hate can destroy. We've got to stop hate in all this. And what we see from this particular text, I know one of the things, Jake, not to take your script away, you often say, what's a quote? Is that this must be very hard for Esau. He was the wronged party, yet he still says to Jacob, let us start on our journey and I will proceed at your pace. Yeah, it must be very hard for him to do that. In particular when people have been victims, when you look at what happened with the IRA and peace and reconciliation and that kind of thing, forging a new future. How can we find a pace that recognises the pain of the person who's been wronged in order to move forward? So I think we try and ensure that talking about capital punishment is taken out of the picture where possible.
Fantastic, thank you for that response. And verse 12 there on the screen, if you've got your own copies printed off, might then be the one that you highlight to look to integrate into your written work. Let us start on our journey and proceed at your pace. I think that was a really interesting point there, because many of our students will be looking at the Sanhedrin as part of the life of Jesus in their Christian belief unit. So that phrase, I don't know if you could give it just correct me if I was wrong there, that if they had the power to enact capital punishment, if they were doing it, was it more than once in a 70 year
if somebody was put to death more than once in 70 years, it was considered a cruel Sanhedrin. Now, by the way, that doesn't mean sometimes it did happen more than that, which was sadly an indictment on them, not on the personalities of the time. But the principle was that we're not looking to take life away in order to sort out reconciliation and restitution.
Fantastic. So if I could just take that over to George, just to reflect on that in light of the passage that we looked at in Luke.
It's always impressive, isn't it, when people who are related to victims, say, of terrorism, and we've had this in the Northern Ireland situation, say that when their loved one is killed, they forgive the person who perpetrated that act, or they forgive the organisation that perpetrated that act. And the call is, as Christians, to be forgiving. I think we've got that in our text. Love your enemies. Do to others as you would have them do to you. Do good to those who hate you. So all of that lies behind, I think, when people come forward and say, I forgive the people who have perpetrated this terrible crime against my loved one. I suppose on a practical level, they are perhaps wishing to free themselves from a desire for vengeance or bitterness, which could blight them their whole life long. And the question I have really is, as a society, is that a value that we seek to uphold? And therefore, having things like capital punishment are not really, they don't really fit in with that sort of social attitude. It's clearly a difficult matter. As a Christian, I believe that everybody is capable of repenting. I suppose you'd say in lay language, perhaps rehabilitation. Everybody can move beyond their acts, which are bad, which are evil. Everybody is capable of turning again, which is what the word repentance literally means, and becoming reconciled to themselves, but also become reconciled to society and to God. So I think we see clearly in this scriptural passage that how you are in society with each other is how your relationship with God is too. Be merciful just as your Father is merciful. We're supposed to pattern, we're supposed to mirror the merciful nature of God in our dealings with others. And so that means that reconciliation should always be a potential that could happen. And we need to seek to encourage people to be reconciled with one another, and a society which seeks to enable reconciliation between people.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that response. And there is a plethora of quotes in there that we'll probably use in the GCSE, but you were just pointing there to that last one on verse 36. Be merciful just as your Father is merciful. And again, that might be the ideal that a Christian might aspire to, though we know that there are sort of different views within Christianity as well. And certainly if you go over to America and you go to some of the Bible Belt, you might get quite a different response there. But thank you very much for that interpretation. That's wonderful. And if I could just go to May soon to finish. And in fact, once you've given your response, we have got a question from Upper Batley for you as well. So if you want to give your response to the capital punishment idea, reflecting upon this passage, then we'll move into that afterwards.
Thank you, Jake. Thank you. And I have seen the question from Batley High, so I will get onto that as soon as I've kind of given my response to the question. Thanks, Jake. So here, capital punishment, there is no space for this in Islam because the firm belief is, just like George has said, Muslims do also believe the same, of repentance, forgiveness, asking God to forgive you if you've made a mistake. It could be anything. It could be as small as theft. It could be as far wide as murder. Do not think you can murder someone and then won't be forgiven for it. The doors of mercy of God are always open. You could be the worst sinner, you could have committed the worst crime, but the forgiveness and mercy of God always prevails. God mentions in the Quran, he says himself that my mercy prevails over my wrath. This is in a separate verse from the Quran. I'm not quoting the family of Imran here, but the quotes that I would like to mention, which is particular for the schools to highlight, is verse number 103, where it says, you were enemies, and then he brought your hearts together and you became brothers by his grace. And then also 104, where it says, be a community that calls for what is good, urges what is right, and forbids what is wrong. Those who do that are the successful ones, because if you are doing that, you will stay away from any form of punishment. But like I said from the start, capital punishment isn't something that is promoted in Islam. It's something that is on the opposite side of the spectrum, so to speak. And addressing the question from the school, do not split into factions, is that referring to the different sects in Islam? My question back is, what are sects? Because if we look to the teachings of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he was the final messenger, as Muslims believe. Then we have to look at what his teachings were, along with the Quranic verses from the Quran. We put them together, merge them together, just like a jigsaw puzzle, and that's what gives us a better understanding of religion, of Islam, and how we should be living our life. And if we look to his teachings, he said on his farewell pilgrimage, the last pilgrimage that he did, that no Arab is superior than a non-Arab, no black is superior than a white. So he has given us equality, but on the same token, he did mention that there would be different sects created in Islam. There would be 70 just before the Day of Judgment. So this is all man-made, but this verse from the Quran in particular is where God is asking us not to split into factions and not do what people are doing nowadays, where they are going into different sects, just like the question's been asked. So I hope that answers your question.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that. I think we've, so we're on 48, so we've got about 2 minutes left of the session, haven't we? I've got no more questions in the chat feed, so I don't know if anyone wants to add anything in just for a last point. I don't know if you have anything else to add there, Alistair.
I think we're probably rounding up to 10 to, aren't we, Jake? Just to welcome Manacroft Academy who've joined us. I know you're coming just in on towards the end of the session on reconciliation, if you've caught up with that. And the session is being recorded, so it will be available afterwards. But I think we'll take a break in a moment till 11, and then we'll be coming back with our final theme this morning, which is on refugees, which obviously is always very topical as well. Just before we go, we've got a question from Madney Academy here. So what was the point of Jacob getting the blessings if he was going to run away? I don't know if Rabbi Jason would like to take that question from the Hebrew text there, the Jewish text, Jacob and Esau.
Okay, so the idea was that Jacob, he obviously was fleeing from his brother's wrath. This was obviously before the spirit of reconciliation that we've just been looking at, and had to build up his family and had to be able to survive in an environment where he had to use all his wits about him and kind of be away from the protective environment of his family. So if you're going to be a leader, you need to know how to utilize the blessings that you have in any circumstances. Funnily enough, that it's the next session, which is refugees, about how do people start from nothing when they had a set up in one place and then they come to another place. How do you take your values with you regardless, particularly when you are challenged by things all around you? So the idea, the point of getting the blessings before he left the family was that he'd need these blessings to survive out there in an inhospitable situation, so that in all circumstances those blessings would come to the fore. That's sort of simple answer, but a straightforward answer to the question.
Many thanks. Thank you to all of you for this session, and to our students for joining in and for submitting your questions. We hope you found it helpful.